Hi, everybody. Bryan Norcross here, and good Wednesday afternoon. It's Wednesday, September 10th, 2025, the peak day of the 2025 hurricane season. Not that you'd really know that that's going on. We're live this afternoon on YouTube and Facebook and TikTok and X. I see a good audience on X this afternoon. And we're on LinkedIn and we're on Instagram. So we're trying to cover everybody. And actually, this system we developed, we did it because these days we don't have the kind of two-way communication leading up to a hurricane that we did many years in the past when we would get people on the telephone, they would ask questions and so forth. They used to do that for hours on end. But now we have a new way, and so we're using it for the first time this hurricane season. So we'll talk about what's going on in the tropics in just a moment, but let me introduce our guest this afternoon. He's the renowned hurricane historian and author. Name is Jay Barnes. Jay is in North Carolina at the moment, right, Jay?
Yes, Brian, I'm standing by.
Okay. All right. And Jay is an expert. If you don't have Jay's books on Florida hurricanes, North Carolina hurricanes, and you're in one of those places, I mean, he's the guy that I go to if I'm trying to figure out some detail or trying to remember something about a Florida hurricane. I go to Jay's book, which is right on my shelf. So we're gonna talk about hurricanes of the past, and of course, we'll talk about what's going on right now. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and do that. Jordan, let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on out there right now. And what we have is next to nothing in the tropics, but we do have the peak of the hurricane season right here. And notice that the slope for the second half is slower than the first half. So it kind of ramps up quickly and then it slowly falls off, relatively speaking. So we have 57, 60% of the tropical activity yet to go, depending on exactly how you measure that. All right, well, in terms of comparing this season to where we would be on average, we've had six named storms. Remember, only one of them was really substantial, and eight would be the average on this date. Normally, we would have three hurricanes if we were on an average pace. We've only had one, and that one was a category three, and one category three is the kind of normal for this date. Two more still to come on average. So there's lots more hurricane season to come. When we look at the tropical energy, which is called ACE, accumulated cyclone energy, we're about two-thirds of what's normal at this point. But we all know that we've had this big, slow period, so we would expect that the numbers would be low. The question is whether the second half is going to do what the second half did last year, which was pick up considerably. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on out there right now. The Hurricane Center just put up this possible development area down here, only 20% on it. Looking at the details of the information that we have, there's a disturbance that's about to come off here, and then maybe it develops in there. Remember, this only goes out a week. The more likely development of systems is going to be more than a week out. It's going to be after next week. When we get to the week after, then there are a number of indications that the pattern is going to change and become less hostile to development. Right now, look out there. You see almost no clouds and almost no thunderstorms here, and all the way over into the Caribbean. There is just a very hostile environment for storm development right now. It's related to, not exclusively, but related to the high pressure system over the Atlantic. There's always a high out there somewhere. And right now, and lately, the high has been extra strong. So what's that do? That drives kind of air from up in here down into the tropics, and that air is relatively dry. It also drives dry air down here that can affect the disturbances coming off of Africa. So just kind of a hostile environment with dry air. And also, of course, Sahara dust is still out there later in the year than normal, may be related to this stronger than average flow coming this way. It's not very thick dust, but it's indeed there. And we have down here these thunderstorms called the ITCZ, where any kind of disturbance has to be separate from those because they kind of steal the energy. So we have kind of a narrow corridor through here. If it's going to go toward the Caribbean, or maybe it's going to go up in there to avoid the dust and dry air and so forth for now. But as we look forward now, look in the upper left here. That's where our time is going to be. So that's today. And there's where the high is we were talking about, the big, strong high. Well, what happens over the rest of this week? Look at this. It kind of weakens and shifts on off toward Europe or Northern Africa. So here we are on Saturday now. And now it's a little bit different because now you don't have this strong flow all the way over. And in this area in here, it looks like there is more potential for development downstream. So we're talking about, a good ways in the future, 10 days or more into the future. But let's look at what we have that we can look at right now for the next week. And here's the disturbance on Saturday that's just coming off. Again, up here, that's this coming Saturday. And we just have a lot of dry air. All this brown is all dry down in here. So everything is kind of threading a needle if it's going to develop. All right, here we go forward in time. And what you're going to see is we get these impulses of moisture coming off of Africa. So here's the one from this week. Here's another one coming next week that looks maybe even a little more robust. And maybe this one is going to kind of moisten the tropics out there. So we'll see. Anyway, our tropical threat modeling, this takes the European, the GFS, and the Google DeepMind model, and then combines them and says, okay, looking at them all combined, where are we going to have development? So you see that first disturbance comes off, and it doesn't do much. And we have some up in here, but all very, very low percentage. Okay. The next one, more robust, as we saw on the moisture, and then it comes out and it shows a more robust signal. Notice some of it coming over this way. So we're going to keep an eye on this for the islands, but this is all the way through a week from now. So this is well after that there's some kind of threat potential to the islands, or is it going to turn north of there? We just don't know at this point. All right. So the one more thing I do want to mention while we're here, and I remember this event, I wasn't in Miami at the time. I was actually in New Jersey at the time. But look at this. This is 65 years ago today. That's Hurricane Donna. That's a radar picture from the Miami radar. The radar at that time was over not too far from the Miami airport. Look at the giant eye on that. And as we've learned from Hurricane Katrina and other systems that are big, they move a lot of water. So this caused a lot of problems. South Florida, up the East Coast, the entire state of Florida covered by this hurricane, Hurricane Donna. And then it went on up the coast, and it ended up being the only storm in the record book to cause hurricane conditions from Miami to Maine. So every state along the eastern seaboard dealt with hurricane conditions. So there's a historic hurricane. All right, Jay, Donna is a story, right, in Florida and North Carolina.
Yeah, Donna is a storm that the folks here in Eastern North Carolina still remember from 1960, those that were around then. And certainly in the Keys, it was quite a disaster. The storm tide there moving across the Middle Keys was, approached that of the 1935 storm, not as high as that record storm surge, but still, Donna is one for the record books, just as you said, traveling from south to north and on the Outer Banks here in North Carolina and up in New England with hurricane force winds.
Yeah, the marathon in the Middle Keys, I mean, it was essentially destroyed by Donna. And it was kind of ironic. You mentioned the 1935 hurricane. We'll talk more about that later because that was an epic event, little bit north of there in the Middle Keys, but not very far. Pretty amazing. When you look at let's say North Carolina hurricanes, because you're in North Carolina, is Hazel the kind of hurricane of record there, or what would you name as the most sort of dominant, the one that people would remember if they were there, especially more than any other storm?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's almost a generational question, Brian, because as we know, that sometimes these great storms can be decades apart.
Right.
And really, in my work and in my books, I talk about how we've really got three measuring sticks for looking at storms. We can look at them meteorologically. We can then also count up the dollar damages, the impact to structures and people's property and so forth, and then of course fatalities. And when you look at all the storms in North Carolina's history, you end up with some different numbers. Helene, for example, is now the deadliest hurricane in our state's history, just from last year,
Wow,
with well
really?
well over 100 fatalities. That's broken the record from the previously set by the 1916 flood up in the western part of North Carolina.
That was the two storms that kind of converged up
Right,
there in
right,
1916, which caused such a flood that they should have known that that could happen in
right.
North Carolina, unfortunately. And I think a lot of that has to do, of course, obviously with the tremendous growth of the Asheville
Sure.
area, and which is a fabulous city, and it's a tough situation that they have. Okay,
And,
so,
and then
so
and then so the second storm that I would mention would be Florence, which was in 2018,
right,
and that was by far the costliest hurricane in terms of dollar damages. Now, we haven't got all the numbers refined yet from Hurricane Helene. Helene may end up being North Carolina's most expensive storm too, but at about $25 billion from Florence, that far surpassed some of the other storms we've had. But you mentioned Hazel, and Hazel is a storm that still to this day, I still have a lot of people who come to me and ask questions about it or like to tell stories about what they remember from this storm in October of 1954. And what's remarkable about Hazel is that it is the only Category 4 known to have made landfall in North Carolina. So our strongest storm meteorologically. So it checks that box easily. Fortunately, there were only 19 fatalities, if you could say only 19, but a relatively low number in North Carolina. But as you know, Brian, Hazel was just a very destructive and deadly storm as it churned northwards from the Carolinas up through Virginia and through Pennsylvania and into New York, and went on to become the deadliest flood in Canadian history.
yeah, in
Actually killed
Toronto.
more people in the Toronto area than it had killed in the United States, and that was due to the flash floods that it produced when it made it up that way.
Yeah, Raymore Drive in Toronto is a whole kind of line of homes that slid into the Humber River. Is
Yeah.
it? Yeah, yeah. I mean, was incredible, and it was another one of these giant storms. As a matter of fact, it set the record for the winds measured in New York City at the Battery in New York City,
That's
the
right.
strongest winds on the edge of Hurricane Hazel. So let's just see what the audience is asking, and we'll get to Florida hurricanes here in just a moment. Jordan Overton is at headquarters in New York City. Jordan is running the controls here this afternoon.
Yeah, so our first question that we'll talk about is from YouTube. What is the probability of a hurricane hitting Georgia this year?
Well, that's that. If we knew that, we would be in a gold-plated weather office, I think. But in any case, so the way that Dr. Phil Klotzbach calculates the odds is he looks at the tropical activity and then adjusts the odds based on what's normal. So we don't have any definitive way, and in Georgia the odds are always low because of a little tiny coastline, and I don't know. Georgia's kind of between your areas there, Jay, but I know that the big Georgia hurricanes was at 1898. Seems to me is the kind of the hurricane of record there, right in Georgia. The Sea Islands hurricane 1893 was a little bit north of Georgia, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, the that storm in 1898 is the only Category 4 landfall in Georgia that we have a record of.
Mhm.
And but one thing to always remember is that you called it right, Brian. The coastline on Georgia is fairly short compared to Florida and the Carolinas, so there's not a lot of opportunity for landfall. But as we've seen with many other storms, striking Florida first and then crossing through Georgia can just make for a lot of devastation, even in places like Savannah and Brunswick that are on the coast. It doesn't have to be a landfall for there to be a significant impact.
Well, the what was the storm? Irma, Irma, and storms like that come north can drastically affect the islands. I mean, obviously, the Sea Islands there in Georgia and down at Jekyll and places like that are very, very vulnerable places, as they are all the way up through South Carolina and into North Carolina, I guess, the barrier islands there, which at the time that Hazel happened in 1954, I mean, the film of what happened down there in Wrightsville Beach and south of Wilmington, oh, was very, very, very dramatic. There just wasn't that much there. Then people didn't have the kind of, there wasn't the kind of beach community that we have today all along the coast.
Well, and not only was there not the growth that we have today, but it was a little bit of a different mentality. In the 1950s on the Carolina coast, if you owned a beach cottage, you were there pretty much in the summer or maybe to do a little fall fishing. And then it was boarded up for the wintertime. And you went back to your home in Greensboro or Raleigh or Charlotte or wherever it might have been. And today, all those barrier islands that face the coast are chock full of full-time residents. So we have a lot of people living on the islands now that we didn't have in the 50s.
Yeah, it was a very different and different kinds of structures completely. I remember we had a little shore house on the Jersey Shore, but it was a little house. It was a little house that, but that my parents could afford, and you didn't have to be a wealthy person to have a house a block from the beach on the Jersey Shore, which is a whole different situation now and along so much of the coast. All right, Jordan, do we have anybody else? Otherwise, I'll go on and we'll talk a lot about Florida hurricanes.
Yeah, so the biggest thing is we have a couple of viewers, of course, from Florida. They were talking about how I was in Florida when I experienced Hurricane Andrew, what a nightmare that was. And Carolyn says, so was I hope to never experience another like it. So, yeah, a couple of viewers reminiscing on Andrew, since you guys are talking about Helene and others. When you were talking about Georgia, I did have a TikTok comment saying, isn't Helene one of the worst hurricanes for Georgia in modern times?
Yeah, it didn't get talked about a lot, but the wind damage through Georgia and in Augusta was quite substantial. As a matter of fact, the National Hurricane Center is considering changing their protocols so that they talk more about wind gusts, because wind gusts increase as the storm goes over land because you get more frictional effect. So there's a number called the gust factor, which is the ratio between the wind and the gusts. And over the water, it's about 1.2. So if the wind is 100 miles an hour, nominally the gusts are 120 miles an hour. But when you get over land, it's very variable. And I used for many years, I would say 1.3 or 1.4 was the kind of average as the multiplier. So 100-mile-an-hour winds, 140-mile-per-hour gusts, say, something like that. But now, by a lot of analysis that's been done, is sometimes it's 1.3, sometimes it's almost double. And so this considering the gusts, and there are reasons for that, the terrain and other things about the storm, considering the gusts is a potential change coming to the Hurricane Center, just being talked about at this point. But it really is significant. I'm sure you've encountered, Jay, a lot of people that went through hurricanes, and you tell their stories. The people that went through Hurricane Andrew, I mean, 100% told me that it was the gusts that blew open the door or that blew off the shutters or took off the roof. They could feel the whoom when a gust came along. It wasn't the just sustained wind.
Yeah, and one of the things that I learned years ago, and it's an important thing for everyone to recognize about the way that wind affects structures, is that when we see the winds increase, say from a 70 to a 90 to 110 to 130. There's a tendency to think, well, it's getting worse, of course, because the winds are getting higher. But what many people don't realize is that the force exerted by wind actually grows exponentially as the wind speeds increase. In fact, there's a doubling of that. So if you had say a 70 mile an hour hurricane, a 140 mile an hour hurricane would exert 4 times the force of a 70 mile an hour hurricane. So it's an exponential increase. And so when you get into those much higher winds like we had with Category 5 Andrew, there's no telling how high those gusts might have been.
Right. And I've talked a lot about Andrew, obviously, over the years. And, the more I've thought about this, and then I've talked about it, and I know I've posted about it. The things that we saw happen in Hurricane Andrew, I have never seen happen in any other hurricane. Never seen 2x4s going through trees and plywood splitting trees and 2x4s going through concrete houses, as a matter of fact. I've just never seen things like that happen. And it didn't behave like a normal storm because, in fact, the thing that set me off while it was happening, and I said, oh, this is going to be the worst imaginable thing. And okay, people, this is what we got to take every possible step now to stay safe. We got live on TV, was I saw this incredible ball of thunderstorms light up the radar on the northern side, and that was going to rotate around over Key Biscayne and then down over the southern part of Dade County, and that was what triggered my thinking, but that was what did the tremendous damage in that first wave. Then there was a second wave that did Homestead. That first wave didn't do Homestead. The thing that did Homestead was the wind coming from the other direction. That was another cluster of thunderstorms, the mesocyclones, they're called, that get in the eye wall. So it is interesting that storms that seem to be somewhat equivalent often have very different amount of damage related to them.
All right.
Yeah, and we also,
Go ahead.
oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
Go
I
ahead,
was
Jay.
just going to add that one other thing that, and I talked to a lot of people just as you have, Bryan, about, people who have survived these storms, whether it be a Hazel or a Andrew or a Michael just a few years ago on the Panhandle, these very strong storms. And a lot of times people will assume that they have seen the worst of it
Mhm.
because they're in the storm. The trees are blowing, the house is getting hit with limbs, and they come out of it okay, and they feel like they've been through that Category
Right.
5. But actually, sometimes that area of the most intense winds is a fairly narrow band.
Mhm.
So you could very well be in a Category 5 hurricane, but only experience Category 3 winds and think that you've seen Category 5s.
Well,
So
this is Fort Lauderdale in South Florida. I mean, because it was pretty bad in Fort Lauderdale and parts of Broward County, but folks, of course, in South Florida, that anybody that went south realized that there was a very sharp line right at Southwest 120th Street, south of the Dadeland complex, and right there, and then everything was destroyed south of there, very much a tornado-y kind of look,
yeah.
but it was, a 20-mile wide band. Jordan, what were you going to say?
It's just kind of a great question coming in here from
Okay.
YouTube. Let me pull it up. Thoughts on historical late season hurricanes. For example, the 1935 Yankee hurricane, a Category 2, made landfall near Miami Beach in November, one of 3 November hurricanes to hit Florida.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the Yankee hurricane really it came from like Bermuda, and it came directly south. It was a very unusual weather pattern that hit in November of 1935. Remember, 1935 was the year of the catastrophic Labor Day hurricane in the Keys that only fringed Miami. In Miami, Labor Day activities actually went on. They had a parade, they had a ball game, and the rest of the workers that had been World War I veterans that were in the Keys Many of them were in Miami for the festivities, Labor Day festivities, thankfully, because the ones that stayed in the Keys didn't get out. What can you say about November hurricanes, Jay?
Well, we often, I think, overlook the fact that our atmosphere is incredibly complex, and what we get out of it sometimes are things that are almost anomalies, things that are unusual. We've had some tropical cyclones in January, for example. They're very rare, but they can happen, and storms in making landfall in the United States as a hurricane in the month of November are fairly few and far between. But there are some that have, had a real impact, and maybe not the category fours typically that you would fear the most. But there have been a number of storms that have impacted our coastline late in the season, and some in June. June is not a month that we typically think of as being a big hurricane month, even though it's technically part of the season. So, those kinds of things can happen. We'll see a storm do things that you haven't seen before. And I always think about, it wasn't in November, but I always think about Hurricane Ivan, and after its landfall, and the large cyclonic track that it took
Right.
back out over the Northeast into the Atlantic, and then headed south, and then came across Florida a second time. So it's really an unusual story with Hurricane Ivan. Not the late season question that we had here, but I just like to think that there's so much variation in what we can see that nothing really should surprise us when it comes to the tracks and the timing of hurricanes in the United States.
Yeah, I remember Ivan. Of course, I was broadcasting during Ivan. And when that storm looped around and came back towards South Florida, I mean, people were really freaking out, and it was a whole lot of work to get folks to not worry about it. But then it went in the Gulf and it went up into Louisiana, didn't it? Does that
Yeah, yeah.
recall? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was something. But just a couple of days ago, we had the 60th anniversary of Hurricane Betsy. And you talk about an annoying storm from a forecasting standpoint, because it went and looped up north of Puerto Rico, and then came and went up. They were talking about putting up hurricane watches in North Carolina. It was kind of heading toward North Carolina, and it stopped off of Cape Canaveral, then came down and essentially stalled over the Bahamas, and then across South Florida. And by that time, across the Upper Keys, actually, by that time, it had pushed so much water up against the coast that the tide was spectacularly high along all the way from Central Florida on down through the Keys. So flooding was a big thing with a storm going over the northern Keys all the way up to Central Florida. It was quite an event. And I was thinking, I would just wonder how well the modern computer models would do with this, some kind of storm doing loops and stalling. And I mean, it was a hellacious hurricane. Not to mention, then, of course, what happened in New Orleans,
Yeah.
which was really set the stage for what happened with Katrina all those years later.
Yeah, Betsy, one of the things I remember about that storm is in the aftermath, and particularly with the flooding in Louisiana, that's when Congress took action to form the National Flood Insurance Program, then following Hurricane Betsy, recognition that people who live in low-lying areas are going to need some kind of protection, or they're going to lose their homes, and that's something we still struggle with today with that flood insurance program.
Yeah, that system does not work. It's
Yeah.
really a hindrance to progress in so many ways. And in New Orleans, they funded, Congress sort of funded the flood wall and levee improvement project, the one that failed during Katrina, but it was really poorly funded and poorly administrated, and it was a mess. Even when Katrina happened in 2005, this was in 1965 that Betsy happened. It still wasn't actually completed, although most of it was, but it wasn't done right. But that was an engineering mistake. But anyway, it also wasn't maintained and administered well, which the new system seems to be. So that's good. Jordan, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have a. This is a bit of a long one, so we'll
All
read
right.
it together. I'll read it for you here. First of all, it's from Carolyn. Thank you for all you do. Cheers from Western Florida and South Florida. Do you guys have any statistics on how well the impact windows are holding up with some of these catastrophic storms? I had heard, I forget which storm it was, that some of the homes that had windows had sustained the windows being impacted from a storm, and some in Palm Beach Gardens from Milton or Helene, when they got the outer bands, the windows were busted out and because of the catastrophic winds. Just curious as to whether glass is holding up. Has there been changes? What's the history? Just kind of a general question about that.
Okay, I didn't know about that. That would be very interesting to know. I can tell you my experience with impact windows is that the glazing, it's called, the stuff that's like the glass, which is actually now with the windows that we have now, it's a sandwich of glass, and then there's a, essentially a plastic, kind of a bulletproof glass in between. And they put the glass on the outside because then you can wash the windows. Where if you put just the bulletproof glass, just the plastic layer, then they tend to scratch and yellow and so forth. So that's why they make the sandwich, and that is spectacularly strong. I mean, that is stunningly strong. Now, the window has to get mounted in a frame, and that frame has to get installed in the house. And if the frame isn't installed in the house, then the whole window can come into the house, isn't installed properly. And in Miami-Dade and Broward County, and theoretically in the state of Florida, that whole thing is supposed to be inspected very carefully to be sure that the frame gets put in and gets really connected to the house. But I think it's fair to say, to get a window person on one of these days to talk about new windows, that the weakest part of the window is the connection of the frame to the house, not the glass. If some kind of glass broke in a hurricane, then I would say that was probably not an impact window. There's no rule you have to have impact windows to do a house. You can do it with shutters, a regular window and shutters, and which is perfectly good. We lived through a lot of hurricanes with that. I don't know, Jay, have you done any work on this?
Well, I did come across a report recently that was looking at the impact from Hurricane Milton on residential properties, and these were mostly single-family homes, and they were sort of trying to gauge the success of the Florida building codes, and what kind of impacts were they seeing. And it was a remarkable report because the success rate for wind for structures built after 2002 was significantly low. I mean, it was something like less than 5% of those homes suffered reportable damages from wind. And this was, again, just a fairly recent study. And I'm sorry I don't know the source of that study, but I agree with you, Brian. I think that the impact windows themselves are going to be very durable and hold up well, even in a powerful hurricane. But they have to be properly installed. And, if there's a failure, there's lots of ways that window could fail that have to do with installation.
Yeah, windows and doors and garage doors. In Miami-Dade and Broward County, where this is the high wind zone, and the code is stronger there. I mean, they just inspect and reinspect and over inspect to be sure that every window and door is installed right. I mean, we'll see. Since the current state of Miami as this, I know, just amazing city full of high rises built to this incredible building code. We haven't had a strong hurricane impact those buildings, and they're so tightly packed together that the wind between them is going to be super strong, and they're really going to be tested. But I'll tell you, you go up in one of those high rises, and little old lady can't open the sliding glass door because it's like a bank vault. I mean, you got to kind of get your muscle behind it to get the door open. I mean, these buildings are spectacularly strong. Jordan?
All right, our next question. Which forgotten hurricane do you think deserves more recognition because of its influence on building codes, infrastructure, or cultural memory?
Well, I was going to ask you a similar question to that, Jay. Would you have an answer to that? And then maybe I'll ask you the revised question I was going to ask you.
Gosh, I guess in a lot of ways it depends on how far back in time you want to go.
Hmm.
There are certainly a lot of candidates. One that comes to mind for me, and it goes back to the quirky nature of hurricane tracks, was Hurricane Easy in
Hmm.
1950, I believe.
Right.
And this was a storm that approached the Tampa area, and it wasn't a tremendously powerful storm. I can't recall. It might have been a Category 2 or
Category
maybe
two. Yeah.
Category 2,
Yeah.
but it actually did a double loop track almost over top of Pinellas County.
Right.
And
Just offshore. So it kept feeding the moisture
right, and
in.
it
Yeah.
I believe set a new rainfall, Florida rainfall record in Yankeetown.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
43 inches, I think, right?
43, yeah,
Yeah.
43 inches of rain just from that event. And it's a storm that is fascinating on lots of levels. It's probably not one of the most destructive, but there's certainly with 43 inches of rain was a lot of flooding in the area at that time.
Yeah, and over the Tampa Bay area, it was one of the kind of landmark storms in Tampa. Helene joined that list, obviously, and Helene was 100 miles offshore. It was just so amazingly big. Well, my slightly revised question of that is when you look at Florida hurricanes, uh, Jay, is there a hurricane that you think is, forgotten, underappreciated? Going back. I have one in mind that we'll see what you come up with.
Well, one of them would probably be the Cedar Key hurricane of 1896, and I've written about that storm. It did have a tremendous impact on Florida and on there in Cedar Key, where the Florida Railroad had just established a very active port, allowing transport from Galveston through Cedar Key all the way up the East Coast. It was a very active port at that time. But that storm was a Category 3, and its impact was very destructive across northern Florida. But much like Helene, it tracked northward through Georgia and the Carolinas on into Pennsylvania, caused a tremendous amount of destruction and death all up the eastern seaboard, just as we saw with Hurricane Helene last year. So I would consider that's one that it's sort of it reminds us, much like we were talking about Donna earlier, about how Florida is really just a gateway very often for epic East Coast storms.
Yeah, that was one of those late 1800 storms. It seemed like North Florida and Georgia just got pounded in the late 19th century. The Tallahassee hurricanes were, was that the 1870s or 18, in that period, just one after the other, and the 1896 storm, the 1898 one going into Georgia. It must it must have really been something. It's amazing how hurricanes tend to group like that, and that was the time for North Florida and Georgia.
Yeah, it was, and I think that there are, if you look at that 1898 hurricane, and like you said, you add in the 1896 storm, they're all really concentrated in that northeastern quadrant of Florida and then southern Georgia that very often is not considered a high value target for hurricanes.
Right.
We don't have a lot of landfalls on the northeastern coast of Florida, fortunately. But very often there are storms that are sweeping from the Gulf and then causing damage like the 1896 storm did. It just did a job on Fernandina Beach.
Yeah. Yeah. And the storm I was thinking of was much more recent. It was Hurricane Eloise.
Ah,
And, we're 50 years from Hurricane Eloise that hit Panama City. It made landfall just west of Panama City. And, and this storm came up because they, when Michael was happening, and well, I know it when it first came up. It first came up in the discussion of the building code, the Florida building code, because they exempted the Panama City area from the Florida building code. And, because we don't get hurricanes. And I go, it wasn't that long ago that Eloise happened. And when you think now of the growth along Route 30 there, and all that going west from Panama City over toward Destin and all the communities and the wealth in there now.
Yeah.
I mean, that just wasn't there. But to me, Eloise is a forgotten lesson for that part of the state.
Yeah, and the other story I like to tell about some forgotten storms was that people often ask me about the naming of hurricanes and how it all got started. And of course, it started in the early 50s when the Weather Bureau first began using women's names. And then by the time we got to the 70s, the women's movement was a thing. It was very prominent, and so with a lot of lobbying, the World Meteorological Organization changed their policy, and they decided that they would begin alternating men's names and women's names. And then that very next year, in 1979, the two storms that struck the United States were Frederick and David.
Mhm.
So somewhat of a payback.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. The men's names were really the worst storm. So one of the viewers mentioned the 1848. I'm sure they were talking about the Tampa Bay hurricane, and there were two of them in 3 weeks, and there never has been a storm since, like the September 1848 storm, but even the October 1848 storm would be a significant hurricane today. I'm sure you've looked at the records that we have from Fort Brooke and the
Yeah.
soldier that wrote a letter. I used to have that letter I can't remember who he wrote it to. Well, what do you know about that 1848 storm, which to me needs to be talked about more in the Tampa Bay area?
Yeah, the I don't remember the exact quote, but the witnesses there at Fort Brooke who were describing the look of the bay and many of the land, what used to be land, they couldn't see land anymore.
Mhm.
It was all covered up with water, and we're talking about Pinellas County now.
Pinellas County. Well, the
Yeah,
whole
it
eastern half
was
of Pinellas County is
the
right.
whole eastern half was
Yeah.
underwater. And then turning and looking back up the Hillsborough River, the only thing that was visible were the very tops of the trees, and that gives you an idea of the kind of a surge that came through this. And this was a Category 3 hurricane. It
Mhm.
wasn't, it wasn't like an Andrew or a Michael. Although what I became fascinated in this story, Brian, I didn't know about it until recently, but I started reading about and talking to some folks about Project Phoenix, which was a tabletop exercise that was conducted some years ago to look at what would happen if a Category 5 hurricane were to strike Tampa Bay.
Right.
And that project is actually, they're going to be doing a third iteration of Project Phoenix next spring, which will be interesting. The second iteration was done during COVID and they had to take some shortcuts, but there's going to be a new version that's going to come out next spring that will, I'm sure, will get a lot of media attention because of, certainly with Helene just visiting the region. And then now you're talking about what if a Category 5 were to strike the Bay. It's going to be an eye opener, I think, when people read about the heights of the surge, the extent of the flooding to be expected from a storm of that nature.
Yeah, some years ago, I put together my list. In fact, I've done this a few times over the years. My list of the most threatened cities or most vulnerable cities in on the U.S. coast from hurricanes. And the number one is either Tampa or Houston. It always goes back and forth, right? Tampa, because so much of the around Tampa Bay and Pinellas and Hillsborough County that is so developed goes underwater in a significant hurricane that makes landfall just to the north of the mouth of Tampa Bay, and Houston because of the petrochemical industries there. And if you get a huge storm surge up into Galveston Bay, and that water goes up the ship channel, and you have flooding of all those petrochemical refineries and everything up there, then you get this very polluted, dangerous, nasty water pushed up into Houston. And right now, there is nothing to stop that. Now, there's a whole conversation about building something called the Ike Dike from Hurricane Ike, referring to Hurricane Ike, which was 2008. They've been talking about this to block the entrance to Galveston Bay to stop that from happening. It's not like people don't know that this could happen, right? And it's not like they don't have a big history of really bad hurricanes pushing water into Galveston Bay. So, they have the evidence. This is not a simple thing to do, but hopefully that project will proceed. Jordan?
Yeah, and I was going to say one other thing about that is that Houston's not the only city looking at those kinds of ventures. In Charleston, there are plans for a multi-billion-dollar seawall that has apparently been approved by the Corps of Engineers and is being discussed by city officials to perhaps take place in the next few years because Charleston has a double problem. Not only are they experiencing significant sea level rise, but the city is sinking.
Right.
And it may be one of the very first cities to really suffer significant destruction unless something is done, like a seawall, to help protect the city. And then New York and others have also talked about barrier walls to try to prevent that kind of a surge.
Right. Charleston and Norfolk actually is another city that has significant flood problems. They don't get hurricanes as often as Charleston does, but 1933, 32, 33,
Mm-hmm.
yes. They had, it's kind of the landmark Chesapeake hurricane there, I guess. I was going to say, oh, and in Miami, the Corps of Engineers actually proposed a huge wall to protect Miami. I don't know if you ever saw that proposal. People in South Florida, just went crazy and they revised those plans and came up with something that was more workable because obviously Miami, you can't put up a big wall and block the view, right? It's not gonna happen in Miami, but
Well, really,
it was a
any
difficult
of these
problem.
projects, if you look at the cost and what's involved and the risk also of
Yeah,
building such a wall, making matters worse somewhere else,
yeah,
there's a lot of work to be done before any of these projects come to fruition.
yes, yes, exactly. Jordan, you have
Yeah, so I've got another question coming in. This one from the Gulf. This is from Dawn on YouTube. Ivan made landfall in Gulf Shores, Alabama as a Cat 3 on 9/16/2004, and Sally also made landfall in the Gulf Shores in 2020 as a Cat 2. Pensacola got the right front quadrant of both. Any other major repeats?
Yeah, there was the great. I mean, this is your area, but let me just say the one. So 1926 hurricane, I think, hit Pensacola, right? And the hurricane in colonial times that hit Pensacola or was near Pensacola. Do I know what I'm talking about here? That had
There,
some kind of effect on the Spanish and the British and well, not colonial times maybe, but in that era, so there was the Pensacola hurricane that.
yeah, it's actually interesting when you look at the history of Pensacola.
Mhm.
Going back to the 1500s, to the very first settlements. The early settlements were built, wiped out, and then rebuilt by another nation. The French would come in and rebuild, and then the Spanish would come back and rebuild. And something like 17 times Pensacola was rebuilt over a period of about 150 years.
Wasn't it
Uh,
originally on the beach? Didn't they originally try and
Yes,
build it on Pensacola
originally
Beach,
on the
right? Yeah,
island. That's right.
yeah.
And then the other one that I would add that was a pretty significant event in Pensacola was the 1906 September storm of 1906, which devastated the waterfront and wrecked a lot of the fleets and so forth. So that's another one that stands out.
So 1906, that must have been a difference. So 1906 is the year that has two hurricanes going over downtown Miami. Right? The eye of went over two hurricanes went over downtown Miami. That's the first two of seven hurricanes in the first 7 decades of the 20th century that went over downtown Miami. But the Pensacola hurricane, I can't picture the track, but it must have been a different storm. But obviously, all these hurricanes were kind of south to north kind of hurricanes. Although
Yeah.
the first hurricane that went over in Miami. No, I think that was an East to West. I think that was an early season one. You know anybody that has a Florida hurricane book that could look that up?
Yeah, the one I was referring to was September 27th of 1906, and it took a track across the Gulf and
Right.
into
Okay.
Pensacola.
Yeah. Yeah, 1906 must have been was a Florida year for sure for hurricanes. The big South Florida hurricane was the one they were building the railroad to Key West, the Flagler Railroad to Key West, and it was a really difficult problem because the Keys were not big. They had to actually extend the Keys to build the railroad, and it was full of mosquitoes and so forth. But there was no place to put the workers, so they brought in these barges and put hotels, kind of residences on the barges. And then the hurricane came along and sent these barges flying, and people died and so forth. And then they revised how they were going to proceed after that and made it a safer process. But they took, what, a year off, as I recall, from building the railroad to try and figure out how to do it more safely.
And those houseboats that you mentioned, the barges, one of them I believe was called houseboat number three,
Hmm.
broke up in the surf, and it was full of workers. I mean, they were on
Right.
board, and as it began to sink, it was actually carried out towards the Gulf Stream, and a handful of the workers clung to the wreckage and drifted for days, and were eventually
Wow.
picked up by schooners going up and down the coast, and then transported into Charleston and into Norfolk as survivors from that event.
Really? I didn't. I never knew that story. That's amazing. Yeah, it was. I mean, the whole railroad story is such an incredible event, just a
Yeah.
wonder of the world that they built that thing. And if you drive down to the Keys today, you can still see, you see what they built. It's so interesting that the bridges that they built there in that first decade of the 20th century, going to take the railroad to Key West, those bridges are still there, and they keep having to maintain the new bridges because the cement that they use today is not as good as it was 120 years ago. It's kind of crazy. Jordan?
Yeah, so our next question coming in here is a little bit of an interesting one. Do hurricanes approaching the Florida Big Bend have a tendency to favor the right side of the cone due to the shape of the coastline?
Um, I don't know. I don't know what the statistics would be on that. So when hurricanes get in curved bays, sometimes they intensify, and the reason is that when the wind hits the coastline, it slows down because of the friction, and it is forced essentially to turn left. And turning left means tightening the circulation some, which can result in intensification if the angles are all just right. And when you have a curved coastline, then it keeps pushing it left, pushing it left, pushing it left, which can cause the circulation to be enhanced. Happens in the southern Gulf of Mexico, in the Bay of Campeche or Campeche, as the modern people say. We always say Campeche. But in any case, it happens down there as well. Whether that affects the directionality of the movement, I don't know the answer to that. Do you know, Jay?
Brian,
Any
I
thoughts?
don't. I think it's an interesting concept, interesting question, and what you're saying about the friction on land is true. However, hurricanes don't steer themselves. They're completely dependent upon the atmosphere that surrounds them. So whether that high pressure to the east or that low pressure or the ridge coming in from the west, those are the factors that are going to steer the storm more so than any shape of the coastline.
Yeah, that's true. Although sometimes if you have an asymmetric storm, the storm can essentially reform in under thunderstorms on one side or something, which does make joggy tracks sometimes. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know of a phenomena like that. It has been interesting, I must say, that we have seen this leaning left or leaning right lately. It seems like, although the average errors are lower than ever from the National Hurricane
Yeah.
Center. It's going to be interesting this year in terms of the development areas. The 20%, 30%, and so forth. That seems like that's been challenging so far this year. We'll see how the overall season works
I
out.
think the dust is certainly a factor this year. It seems more so than previous years recently. I mean, I know there's always Saharan dust, as a factor, but it does seem like it's been very prominent this year.
What's interesting is the measurement of the density of the dust is it's very low. It's near record low. But I agree with you, Jay. The extent of it seems to, it seems to be there all the time. And here we are well into September, and usually by this time it's fading out. But there is a thing going on which is worth talking about. This season has similarities to last season in that we went through this long period without much activity where thunderstorms couldn't form because the temperature profile in the atmosphere was thwarting it to some degree. The atmosphere is just kind of warm aloft, and you need to have the warm air is going to rise. The cooler it is aloft, the faster it rises, the more the thunderstorms can form. And so the obvious question is, has this got something to do with just a general changing climate and a general changing profile over the Atlantic? And is this going to affect hurricane seasons to come? There's also the discussion about south of Greenland due to freshwater ice melt. You end up with a cool pool of water, unusually cool there. And the water temperature affects the wind direction and wind flow, and how does that affect things? So anyway, these questions are open questions at this point about if there are macro factors affecting hurricane season, because there are fewer tropical systems all around the northern hemisphere. I mean, the Western Pacific may set a record this year for weak storms. Not that they haven't had any storms, but they haven't been strong. They haven't been Category 3 and above. And that's really unusual in the Western Pacific. So, what is causing this general phenomenon of storms not being as strong or not as many developing? That's an open question that, lots of scientists have been working on for some time. I don't really have a good answer for that. Jordan?
Yep, so this will be one of our last questions here as we kind of get to the top of the hour. This is a little bit more forward-looking. How are you doing? I'm in Louisiana. Do you think we will get a storm in the Gulf, even though the season really haven't had a storm yet?
Well, the season for the Central and Eastern Gulf hasn't really started yet. The second season, we had one. The first, remember, the Gulf season is early in terms of storms forming in the Gulf. I mean, generally early and then late. And we had the early one, and we had these kind of weak systems. But now we're going to have the late one, like we did last year, and like we did last year when we had Milton and Helene. They formed in the western part of the Atlantic Basin in the Caribbean or the Gulf. Now, Louisiana is kind of in the middle, because you say that once we get to late in September, Texas's hurricane season is over, and Florida's hurricane season has a good ways to go. Louisiana is in the middle, but you can still obviously well into September get a storm in Louisiana. Statistically, where does all that stand, Jay?
Well, I was going to ask you a question, Brian,
Okay.
and you probably have this information better than I do. The sea surface temperatures in the Gulf last year were quite warm, record levels, really. How are the temperatures looking in the Gulf this year?
Yeah, they're very warm. What I don't know is just immediately, because there's been this front, although the front hasn't been so much cold air, because the Gulf responds to cold air, right? And the last time I looked, the Gulf was at record levels, and in terms of temperature, and the Western Caribbean was very, very warm. The Eastern Caribbean and the Atlantic are not that they're cold by any means. They're not super warm like they were last year and the year before, which is also, I think, contributing to fewer storms forming out that way. But when they do the average of all of the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf, they say, oh, this is the sixth warmest ever. But that's not because of the Eastern Atlantic. That's because of the Western Caribbean and the Gulf. So yeah, when storms, if we get seeds of storms that make it through the Caribbean and get into the Western Gulf, we would expect they would have more energy to work with. Jordan?
All right, yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up for today's questions.
All right, so Jay, before you go, let me see if we can get people interested in your books here. You have a new book that you're working on, so tell us about that.
I'll be happy to, Brian. The new book is underway and will probably be out in late 2026. And the title is 15 Hurricanes That Changed Florida. And this book is patterned after, I guess you'd say, a mirror image, really,
Yeah.
of another book that came out in 22 called 15 Hurricanes That Changed the Carolinas. And my premise for both of these books really is to look at, okay, let's choose 15 of the greatest, biggest, baddest storms that we've had. And so with in the case of Florida, all the ones we've talked about are in there, mostly Andrew and Michael and Helene, and then going back to the 1896 and many of the storms we just talked about. But really the focus of the book is what are some of the lessons that we've learned? What are the takeaways from each of the 15? And then to look ahead at what can we expect in the years and decades to come in Florida. There's certainly a lot to unpack there because it takes you way away from hurricanes, and you start talking about things like impact windows and insurance rates, and all the various things that are important to Florida residents, because hurricanes are not going away. And with the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, a lot of people are curious. What can we expect in the future? So what I have done is with this book is to talk to a lot of experts, including you, Brian. You did a great interview with me just recently, and try to pick the brains of the people who really know the meteorology, the engineering, the resilience efforts, the insurance industry, the real estate industry. What are all these people talking about with regard to the future? And it's been fascinating. It's still underway, probably be out, like I said, sometime next year. But it's not only a history book, but it's a look at the future.
All right, and of course you have the book that I have it's Florida Hurricanes, right? So if you want to, if you need a reference guide on the expanse of Florida hurricanes, how recent does that book go? How far does that
That book is actually the second edition, goes all the way through Wilma. So it does not include Irma or Ian or some of our more recent storms. Right. Those will all be included in the new book. But the Florida Hurricane History book, my goal at that time was to just really give a comprehensive view of the important storms going all the way back to the days of the first European explorers. And it's been a fascinating journey to read and learn about them. People ask me all the time about, well, where do you get all your information? And I pull it from the sources you would expect, from the Weather Bureau, from the National Hurricane Center, and other government agencies, but also talk to a lot of people who remember the storms like Hazel we were talking about earlier. Going back and getting those stories about what happened in communities, what was the evacuation like, what was the recovery like, and there's a lot of tragedy. There's a lot of what you would expect, people suffering great loss in storms like the 1935 or the Miami storm of 1926, the Okeechobee hurricane of 1928. These are all epic events in Florida's history. And but again, I'm interested in not only sharing their stories, but to glean from them what we can about how can we learn from what has happened in the past so that we don't make the same mistakes again.
Right. That's it's horrible to think that these things would have happened with no benefit for the future. I said that after Hurricane Andrew, actually. All right, so if you're interested in hurricane history, especially in Florida, North Carolina, just look up Jay Barnes on Amazon and you'll see his books. And we'll look forward to the next one, Jay. Thanks very much for coming on this afternoon. We really enjoy doing these things.
Well, Bryan, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. All right, Jay Barnes, and all right, that's it for this week, and we'll be back next week, and we'll see how the hurricane season is going. All indications are it's going to take till the week after that until things become more active. But anyway, we'll just see. Not going to predict anything definite. We'll just see. All right. Have a good evening, everybody, and stay in touch with us on Fox Weather. If you're not sure how to get Fox Weather, it's foxweather.tv. This will give you the instructions to get it on your TV, your phone, your tablet, your computer, and it's always free and always on. Fox Weather. All right. Have a good evening, everybody, and stay in touch, and we'll see you soon. Take care.